Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my channel. Today in this video, let's talk about a super interesting grudge match in the chess world. The main players are Russian Grandmaster Daniel Dubov and American Grandmaster Hans Niemann. So in this tournament, there are just these two players competing against each other. And actually, these two have quite a history. Last December, at the 2024 FIDE Speed Chess World Championship in New York, Dubov actually just shockingly he didn't show up for round 10 of the Blitz preliminaries where it was actually just a very critical sprint phase of the tournament, and he just didn't show up. He was automatically disqualified, giving Hans Niemann a free point to advance to the next stage, while Dubov himself was eliminated. Later on, he actually claimed he had fallen asleep back at the hotel between rounds, but many people just suspect he deliberately avoided playing against Hans, especially since Dubov had previously questioned Hans Niemann's rapid race in the ratings. So this actually just shows that maybe he is a little suspicious about whether if Hans Niemann has, done something bad to help him rise so fast in his ratings and everything. And just a few days ago, actually, these two faced off in a live online blitz match in Moscow to settle the controversy. This match took place at a chess studio and spanned 2 days of intense blitz chess. There are 18 rounds in total, and actually on day one, Dubov was simply on fire. He was leading the match by a wide margin, actually by a 2-point lead. Actually, after day one, if I'm not mistaken, he has 5.5, whereas Hans only has 3.5. So it's in a 2-point lead, a huge margin. But Niemann, he managed to win a few games in the middle, but by the end of day one, Dubov still has a big lead. But on day two, it was just even more exciting than day one, with Niemann mounting a furious comeback, tying the score at 1 point. In the final game, though, this is a very crucial game. Before round 18, the last round, these two players, they both have 8.5 points. So the last round is extremely crucial for them, because if you won, then if you win this game, then you'll have first place. So in the final game, Dubov was playing with the white pieces, and after 68 moves in a knight and pawn endgame, both sides are under time pressure, so everything is just happening really fast. Dubov, at the end, managed to win by forcing Niemann to run out of time, narrowly securing a 1-point victory. And after the match, Niemann went through a polygraph test, as agreed before the match. Though the results haven't been released yet, Niemann responded to the accusations with confidence, because so many people, they suspect him to cheat in some of the tournaments, but of course there's no evidence to that. And Hans himself, he said that the games spoke for themselves. He has a very famous line where he says chess speaks for itself. And Hans himself even challenged top players rated over 2,700, and on social media, sometimes even on live chess, offering large cash money, cash prizes for the matches. Hans is undoubtedly a very strong player, but the controversy surrounding him is just so massive. What do you think about this? So I'm actually asking about your opinion about him, and feel free to drop a comment to share your thoughts about him. But let's now turn back to this match. Just focus on the games, all the skills, the chess skills between these two strong grandmasters. This match was full of drama. But no matter what, let's get back to the main point. There was just so many exciting moments in this matchup. And today, let's take a look at two of the games that has been played in all the 18 rounds. And also, before we do that, I'm gonna quickly read this article, just some of it. So here we have Grandmaster Daniel Dubov won an 18-game blitz match against Grandmaster Hans Niemann with a final score of 9.5 versus 8.5. As the prize, Niemann had agreed to answer one question with a polygraph test. The match, which took place March 7 to 8 in Moscow, Russia, was a follow-up to the round 10 encounter at the FIDE World Blitz Chess Championship that took place in New York last December. Niemann flew to Moscow to play in the 2025 Aeroflot Open, but along the way he struck a deal with Dubov. The match would happen on the latter's home turf and would supposedly settle a dispute they had, which is the story that I've just said. I mean, in December, Dubov didn't show up to his game with Niemann, and the latter won by forfeit. And at the time, Dubov claimed that he had got to his hotel room, fell asleep in the 15 minutes between rounds, and then didn't wake up in time for this game. Niemann had a different theory, though, as he told NRK that he said that, "I don't think he's my biggest fan." He said, "Usually when someone doesn't show up against me, I have one assumption." With the free point, Niemann drew his next 3 games and qualified for the knockout on the next day. He would go on to win Game 2 in the quarterfinals against Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, but lose 3 and 4, thus losing the match to the world co-champion to beat. So this is actually like the backstory of this whole match that is happening in Moscow. And basically here, soon after, the players agreed to settle their dispute on the 64 squares. Some particulars about the format and Nobel Prize in Chemistry recipient CM Demis Hassabis moderating didn't stick, but the match and the lie detector would proceed 3 months later. Chess.com has used the polygraph test for several videos with grandmasters like Magnus Carlsen. Though as the American Psychological Association writes, most psychologists agree that there's little evidence that polygraph tests can accurately detect lies, it still makes for entertaining content. So that is a lot of backstory, and here we have Dubov. Some of the details about Dubov. He is a really strong player, especially in blitz. Dubov won the 2018 World Rapid Chess Championship and is also one of the world's best blitz players. In 2016, he finished 3rd in the World Blitz Chess Championship, and then in 2023, he came 2nd. He is perhaps best known for his creative approach in the opening. There are several openings named after him even, and he has worked as a second for Carlsen. Here we have the match. All the games, and this is the article that I'm reading to you guys. You guys can actually check it out on chess.com. There are a lot of videos and everything if you guys are interested. But today, let's now jump into the game. This is round 13. We have Hans with the white pieces and Dubov with the black pieces. So Hans here started with e4. We have e5, knight f3, knight c6, and basically this is just the Italian. Everything is very normal. We have d3, bishop e7, castles, rook e1. So the opening is actually just really normal so far. Everything is theory. h6. So h6 is always a move that is very logical, preventing some bishop g5 ideas, and just simply opening up some space for the king. Sorry, my throat is actually hurt a little bit. Bishop d2, rook e8, b4. So white is actually now playing really aggressive, starting some pawn attacks on the queen side. Here we have the move bishop f8. Dubov is simply just, ignoring everything, and here we have knight e3 on the board. Basically, both sides are just maneuvering their pieces, and here, most likely, this knight will jump to this f5 square. But here, actually, for white can also go for some c3, d4 ideas, which is very similar to the Ruy Lopez, where white tries to gain some space in the center. But in the game, we have knight e3, and then d5 was played. Sorry. D5 was played, and then we have b5. So here b5 and attacking this knight. Now, where should this knight go to? Well, of course, it goes to d4, but actually knight e7 might have been a little bit better because this knight will have this idea of going to g6 and then to f4, and also it just simply defends the d5 pawn. But in the game, however, knight d4 was played, it's somehow more like trying to go for some positional play by offering a trade of knights. And in the game, Niemann took on d5 first. We have knight takes f3, and after queen takes f3, black played e4. So actually, this is already starting to be a little bit aggressive. Black is pushing the pawn in the center and trying to just simply, break through. White's pawns are pushed really high up the board, but are somehow like floating, and especially the d5 pawn right now, it is unprotected. So black is, of course, not doing bad. In the game, we have queen e2. Because if you take on e4, then after knight takes e4, black will, first of all, gain a tempo by attacking this bishop. But then after you treat the bishop, then probably black will just simply develop this bishop with bishop b4, another tempo. And it's actually not that good for white. And that is why in the game, instead of taking on e4, Niemann just simply ignores it and played queen e2, which is a very logical move. And in the game, we have bishop c5, developing the bishop, rook a d1, developing the rook, and also supporting the pawns. And here we have bishop takes e3, another exchange, f takes e3. Now, actually here, taking with the queen is slightly better than taking with the pawn, because if you take on d3, obviously you take back with the queen, and if you take with the knight on d5, there's queen g3 here, threatening bishop h6. And also here, if you take with the queen, there are many possibilities here for black. You can take with the knight, take with the queen, or take this pawn. Taking with the queen is probably the best reply here, but still white can play something like, queen g3 and threaten bishop h6. And it's not that clear, but both sides are actually having some chances, though. In the game, however, instead, Niemann decides to take on e3 with the pawn. Maybe he doesn't want to really simplify the position that much. At least right now, he just wants to keep all of the rest of the pieces on the board to try to keep the position tense. Here we have d takes d3 and c takes d3. Knight takes d5. We have e3 here, e4, sorry. And actually, right now, even though white seems like white is doing great, like attacking the knight and everything, but as you just see that after, for example, knight f6, these pawns are really hard to be pushed further. Because if you push e5, this knight will just simply, go back. And actually right now, it doesn't really need to, because there's this pin over here, which makes it impossible for white to take on f6. But here for black can even just start to open up the queen side by playing a6. And actually, black is having a slight advantage here. In the game, if you don't push e5, then let's say you go for some bishop c3 ideas, but d3 and e4 are two weaknesses. And especially after the queens are off the board, these pawns will become even bigger weaknesses. And still, black is going to go for a6 to open up as many files as possible on the queen side to activate the rook. But in the game, however, we have knight takes d5, e4, and instead of retreating back to f6, which is the best square, instead, Dubov decides to play knight e7, which is a small inaccuracy, and then simply allowing bishop c3. Not blockading this diagonal, and if the knight were on f6, it would at least blockade this diagonal, but now this g7 pawn is even weaker because queen g4 is coming, and it's kind of hard to defend this pawn without creating any weaknesses. In the game, we have knight g6 and rook f1 was played. Well, this is a small inaccuracy because it looks logical at first, but it's just too slow. And the best move here is actually to play queen b2. Still, the main focus is on this g7 pawn. And let's say if black defends it with f6, then you just push d4 and queen d7. Most likely this is going to be a very normal game, but white is having a small advantage. In the game, however, we have rook f1, and in the game, queen d7 was played, defending the pawns on the 7th rank. We have rook f3. So Niemann's idea here is actually to, probably like double the rooks on the f file and everything to put some pressure on the f7 pawn. And in the game here, we have king h7, and then e5 was played, but actually rook df1 is the best move here. You just need to follow your plan to attack the f7 pawn. But I don't know why, but in the game, Niemann decides to push e5. I guess this is a move that he is just in a hurry to play and without any calculations or everything. Like, this is definitely a move that is not in the computer's favor. But in the game, however, Dubov didn't play the best reply here. He should have played a6. Again, this is a move that is always in the favor of the engine. a6, I mean, this is like, in a lot of times here, it is the best move, considered in many positions. Again, at this point, a6 is the best move, trying to open up the queen side, but it's just a move that is so, like, it looks insignificant. Like, no, maybe that's not the right word, but it looks like a move that is not that easy to catch someone's attention. And in the game, we have queen d5, which is also fine because you're like activating your queen and everything and putting pressure on the pawns. But here we have d4. This just simply allows white to push the pawns, link them together, and defend each other. Here we have f6, which was played in the game, and this is actually a mistake by Dubov, the start of the wrong direction. What he should have played is now not to go a6, because it doesn't really do anything anymore, but here instead to just simply play rook ac8 and prepare for c6, to try to open up the c file instead. And even going c5 at some point to try to break white's pawn structure. But in the game, however, Dubov decides to play f6, and I guess maybe during the game both sides don't have enough time, and now it's just their first thoughts coming to their mind and they just play it. In the game, we have queen c2, and queen c2 is maybe not the best reply here. Rook g3 is slightly better, but queen c2 is also fine. And after queen c2, suddenly the reason that f6 is such a big mistake, is because it no longer defends this g6 knight. And this is now a terrible weakness of black. In the game, we have f takes e5, but here d takes e5, attacking the queen as well. Black is now in huge trouble. This only move, queen c5, should have been played in the game. All of the other moves are losing. Queen c5 is the only move that still equalizes the game. We have king h1, and now you have to play rook takes e5. But you just soon realize that white cannot take back because the queen is hanging, and probably white will still try to challenge black by playing some sort of queen b3 moves, but I think this is much easier to defend. And in the game, however, queen c5 is the only move, but unfortunately Dubov didn't play it, and instead he played queen e6. Now, this is already winning if white had played rook df1, because rook f7 is kind of just unstoppable, and also rook f6 is coming. But in the game, however, Niemann missed it and he played queen e4, which also just seems like a move that is really attractive, because you defend everything and you're also attacking the pawns. But here, black can play rook a d8, developing this rook, and suddenly it's not that easy for white to slide into black's position. In the game, we have rook df1, but this is just the wrong move order. But actually, unfortunately here for black, Dubov made another mistake by playing king h8. Now, this is a move that I can fully understand because he wants to, run away from this pin, because this is definitely annoying and he wants to free his knight. But now after king h8, there's this really tricky but quiet move, h3, which was played in the game. Now, of course, queen takes b7 would have been also really nice for white, but h3 is also a really nice touch. And what is the idea behind this move? Well, as you can see in the game, knight f8 first, and here the idea is actually to go, well, in the game, however, Hans didn't play the best reply here. The idea is actually to go king h2 here, to get the king to safety. Basically, that's it. And now you're free to move your rook, because then there won't be any back rank problems like rook d1 or something. The king is just really safe on h2, and also you can support the rook to go into g3 or something. And also, this pawn gains control of the g4 square. This is how white should be playing. But in the game, however, instead of playing king h2, Hans instead played a5. Maybe his idea was that, okay, I'm going to switch on some attack on the queen side. In the game, Dubov played knight h7. We have queen takes b7, simply Hans is just gobbling up a pawn. We have queen d5 here, but then there's queen takes a7. Maybe Hans got a little bit greedy. He would definitely won after taking the c7 pawn. I mean, c7 is definitely a pawn that has much higher quality than the a7 pawn. But instead, queen takes a7 was played in the game, and we have knight g5 on the board, attacking the rook. But now there's rook e3. The rook simply defends the e5 pawn and everything. We have knight e6 blockading the passed pawn with the knight. But here we have rook f3 back and queen takes b5. Because if you played knight g5 again, then maybe instead of playing rook e3 again, there's rook f5, which would be a better option. But in the game, however, queen takes b5 was instead played. Now, white is not winning, but of course, already white has a pretty big advantage, positional advantage that is. In the game, we have queen f2, so white retreats the queen back and prepares for some kingside attack. We have queen c4, and then queen g3, threatening like putting some pressure on the g7 pawn, queen e4, rook e3, and then queen g6, queen c5. But after a few mistakes by both sides, well, actually, especially for white, the position suddenly turns back into an equalized position. But again, this is blitz chess, so anything can happen. In the game, we have rook e1, knight f4, and then a couple of very normal moves, rook takes d1, e6, and here disaster struck. In the game, Dubov played queen g5. Now, white is not winning, of course, but at least right now it gives white some chances because this pawn can now start to push. But in the game, however, due to time trouble, Hans played e7, missing the opportunity. But then here, well, Dubov defends really well, and he played rook d7. We have h4 in the game. Now, this position, if it were in the classical game, definitely black will be the side who is trying to play for a win. But here, disaster, like the biggest disaster in the game struck. And Dubov here played queen takes e7. But this is like a blunder and simply creating a huge tactic that white has. And can you see it? Bishop takes g7. A brilliant move. And in the game, I mean, if you take on g7 with the king, let's say, after queen g4, king h7, white wins the queen for 2 rooks, but black would still be able to hold this position objectively with accurate play. But I guess in blitz chess, white will likely win. But in the game, however, instead of taking, king g8 was played instead. We have bishop e5 on the board. At least right now, still black has some holding chances. But then after this queen f7 move, the game is basically over. Queen e6 is the only move to defend, keeping the bishop pinned. And here, after queen e6, if you go king g1, let's say, rook g7, again, only move here. I mean, rook g7, only move. And then after queen f3, rook d7, and white, I guess, just can't not really make any progress. Queen e4, rook g7, this is going to likely end in a draw. But in the game, however, queen f7 was played instead, and we have king g1, a couple of inaccuracies, but in the end, Hans manages to win this game after rook g7, because he just wins the queen. So this is game 13, the first game that we're taking a look at today, and now let's take a look at this game. This is the last round, the most crucial round of this tournament. And we have Dubov with the white pieces, Hans with the black pieces. In the opening again, I'm going to go through this really fast. This is the Queen's Gambit declined, the Catalan actually. Well, actually, it transferred into the Catalan. And after a6, this is all very normal, theory, standard. And bishop e4, queen c1, c6, e3, knight bd7, knight c3. Developing the knight, and here, actually, the bishop has a lot of, like, objectively speaking, it has a lot of squares to go to. f5, g6, d5, d3, d3, and even you can take on f3. But the best 2 moves are actually bishop f5 and bishop g6, where you want to keep this bishop on this diagonal. Well, the reason that you don't go bishop d3 is because simply you just help white to develop the rook here. The best move is actually to go bishop g6 back. You just keep this bishop on this diagonal and control these weak light squares in white's territory. But in the game, however, Hans instead took on f3, giving white the bishop pair, and this is not the correct option. After bishop takes f3, and now you see that this is a bishop that dominates the light squares. It just simply puts so much pressure on the c6 pawn, and it controls all of the light squares. e4 supports e4. This is a very strong bishop, and it is quite impossible for black to trade it off. In the game, we have rook c8 defending the pawn, knight e2, c5, and then basically the game continued for another 20 moves without any huge mistakes by both sides here. We have queen d1 back, and here in the game, Hans decides to play knight f6. But instead, this knight might have been slightly better on c5 because it does gain more control of the squares and also threatens the d3, threatens to jump into d3 at some point. But in the game, however, knight f6 was played, and this is not as good as knight c5 here. In the game, giving white the chance to run away from this pin first, and then g6 was played in the game. We have h3, a4, f4, rook takes c1, rook takes c1. A pair of rooks are now off the board here. And here in the game, we have knight e d7, of course, rook c6, but suddenly you see that white is out of black's control here. Before you see that, let's say, move here, black is doing really well. These pawns are pushed really high up the board and controlling, limiting white's minor pieces, especially white's minor pieces activity. But here in the game, however, after a couple of moves and a couple of exchanges, after knight f6, queen e2, g6, h3, a4, takes, suddenly you just realize that after a couple of moves, white is suddenly better. Because about 10 moves ago, black is slightly better. But then, suddenly, in chess, these kinds of things happen. You think you're better, but then after playing a few moves, you just realize, wait a second, my opponent is just throwing all of his pieces towards me, and I'm in huge trouble here. And that is exactly what's happening here. Rook c6, and white is in the attacking mode, attacking the queen b8 back. We have rook c4. Now the main problem for black is that he no longer has a dark square bishop, and this means that these pawns are really weak without anyone defending it besides the queen. And in the game we have queen d6, knight c6, but you just see that black is in huge trouble here with all of the pieces really passive and everything, with these knights unable to activate. In the game we have rook e8, but simply after rook d4, queen f8 back, but queen c5, sorry. Technically speaking, this is the best move here, but the queen f8 was played in the game, just simply allows rook takes b4, because if you play queen c5 here, rook takes b4, I guess, doesn't work that nice because there's knight b6 here. And if you if you play something like rook d4 here, you just get this knight to d5. Well, actually, I think the f knight to d5 here. And even though white is now up a pawn, but black at least manages to get the knight to good squares. And also, e4 is not possible here because there is this pin. The queen is pinning the rook and the king, and that is why black should play queen c5. But in the game, however, queen f8 was instead played, and we have rook takes b4. Now there's no longer knight b6, of course. e5 was played instead. Nice try, but white is now much better here. Queen c4 was played, but actually Dubov should just just take another pawn, and that's completely fine. But in the game, maybe he wants to limit more of black, limit black's pieces more, and he played queen c4. And in the game, we have queen d6, and here Dubov actually made a mistake by playing king h2. Maybe he thought that he had some back rank, problems with queen d1 check, for example, which is quite annoying. But I guess that is just something that he don't really need to worry about. If he really worries about queen d1, he can even play queen c1 here to defend everything. But in the game, however, he played king h2, and then h5 was played. But unfortunately here black can actually play e takes f4, and here white can only take with the queen, because if you take with the e pawn, this just simply allows black's rook to be opened, and then queen d2 comes, rook e2 comes, and obviously taking with the g pawn is nothing good, because you just lose the e3 pawn. But instead in the game, h5 was instead played. Maybe the idea was to go h4, who knows, but it's a mistake, like missing the opportunity to take on f4. In the game, rook b7 was played, but I mean, it's a blitz game, so all of these inaccuracies, mistakes are all reasonable. E takes f4, queen takes f4, queen c5. This is a mistake because it simply just allows white to go knight b8. And actually, if white had played this move, then white will be completely winning. But in the game, however, Dubov here blundered by playing queen d4. And why is this a blunder? Simply because he blundered the e3 pawn. He blundered the pawn, and now position is completely equalized once again. We have the queens off the board, and again we're into a very boring endgame, where at least it seems boring. We have the pawns traded off the board after, well, maybe white is still better because white has a passed pawn, but then after a couple of moves here, the position is once again equal. The pawns are equal, both sides have 3 pawns, but the only way that white can try to win is to use this pawn to distract the king and the knight and try to get this king to the king side, up the board to win the pawns. But this is really hard, and if this were in a classical game, definitely this is going to end in a draw. But it's in a blitz game, and anything can happen. We have king e7 on the board, and then knight b4, b7, knight c6. The knight is in time to defend it. We have h4, but basically this is just a draw. King e6, king g2, and then king d5, everything is normal. f6, knight b3, king c6, and, here, g5, g4. A breakthrough tactic that nearly deserves to be in endgame books. And this is a move that is actually really nice. Even though this is not a winning move, but, in blitz games, this is considered as brilliant because you don't have time to think about how should you exchange it or something. This is a move that is, deserves to be an endgame book. Even in endgame books, there are positions where it's really similar to this position. And it doesn't objectively win, of course, but in the game with only little time on the clock, Hans made the losing move by playing h takes g4. Now, he would have saved the game by playing g takes h4, and after g takes h5, h3, knight f3, stopping the pawn. Of course, if you play here h6, black will queen first with check, of course. But here in the game, knight f3, stopping the pawn, knight d7. Now the black knight does the same by defending the h pawn. And here after, a couple of moves, here at the very end, like knight h7, king g7, knight g5, and at the very end here, it will be a draw. But in the game with only little time on the clock, we have h takes g4 on the board. This is a heartbreaking moment, and after h takes g4, but it happens, especially in blitz games. h5, and black is just not in time to stop it. Knight f3, but now white just simply takes this g3 pawn on the very next move, and this pawn is unstoppable. And with that, Daniel Dubov wins this match between Hans Niemann. But, Hans is undoubtedly a strong player. Even though there are many controversies surrounding him, still we cannot deny that he is not a good player. He is a very strong player. And we can see that in these two games. Well, in this game, however, he did made an endgame mistake. But, before this move, he played extremely well. At the very end, he did show that he is truly, playing with his own skills, didn't use anything else. And, even though he lost it, he is just 1 point behind. And he is facing one of the strongest blitz players in the world. So this is already really impressive. All right. But still, there are many things about him, and, many controversies surrounding him. Who knows, though? You can share your opinions about him in the comments. But right now, hope you guys enjoyed these two games, as well as this video, and please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!